Okay, my watch says it's 2 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody here in person and those of you online. Our topic of our class today is finding your Scottish ancestors. My name is Sherry. I'm a reference genealogy associate here at Midwest Genealogy Center, and we're going to do a little conversation about our Scottish ancestors. If you'll look at the screen here, notice that we have a little AI generated photograph I did of a Highlander with his dress Scottish tartan on. You will find out as you do more and more research, when you find out if your ancestors belong to a clan, that they did have military tartans that may slightly be different from the dress tartans that they had or just the regular tartans they had. All right, where do we start in this particular journey? Just like we do with any other genealogy research, you start with yourself and you work your way backward. Our goal in this particular instance is to find that immigrant ancestor that came over from Scotland. Or maybe if your ancestor is Scots-Irish, he came from Scotland to Ireland and then from there to the US. So we want to find information on where he was from or she was from, because there's no central location for records there. So you want to kind of narrow down your search as close as possible because you really don't want to be searching records in the entire country. So we start here in the US. We look for every record we could possibly find once we find that immigrant ancestor who immigrated to the US. We want to basically find out what his full name was, he or she, the date they arrived, and their place of origin. And you can find a lot of that information in certain documents, such as naturalization records. Some passenger lists, if they still survive, may have information on from at least what county they came from. Other documents you might be looking at, maybe you've run into a brick wall for this immigrant ancestor and you're still not finding that place of origin. Remember too, what we call the FAN method, which is friends and family, acquaintances, and neighbors. A lot of the times, Scottish immigrants settled in towns or areas with other Scottish immigrants from the same locations. So if you run into a brick wall with your ancestor, do feel free to research either siblings there, neighbors there, people that are listed in maybe in newspaper articles with them, because they will probably be from the same location and you might be able to find that information from other places as opposed to your ancestor. Social media is another example. There are a ton of Scottish genealogy research groups on Facebook. In fact, I was doing a quick search this morning. You've got the Friends of Scotland research group, Scottish People research group, Scottish Ancestry research group, and a lot of those groups don't have people not just from the US, but from all over the world. I have run into some of the research groups that I belong to that have people in the location where my ancestors were from, and I've requested records that they have been kind enough to go to the particular registrar's office and get them for me. So you never know what you're going to find. Do take advantage of social media. Also, immigration patterns. Scottish, as well as some of the other ethnic groups that you probably or have ancestors with, did follow a certain path. And if you know that path, you might be able to narrow down where they were from. Again, if, for example, let's say your ancestors were from Edinburgh, and from Edinburgh they came to the US, say, via the Carolinas. A lot of the people from Edinburgh will do that same immigration pattern. So from there, you're going to figure out, if you can't find it on a record, for instance, you may be able to locate it just researching immigration patterns for those particular people living in that area. So some of the immigration patterns for Scottish immigration, they started around the 1600s. Most of them during this time period, the 1600s and the 1700s, they came after Cromwell pretty much sent them all to the American colonies. You will find as you research the history of Scotland, they didn't always get along with the English crown, and there would be wars and battles from time to time. Well, during the 1650s, when Cromwell was leading the English armies, they had battles with the Scottish. And unfortunately for the Scottish, the English won. Well, instead of putting them into prisons, they just sent them to the colonies, because at this particular point in time, the colonies were still part of the English Empire. So that's why you see a lot of Scottish men entering the Americas. The English were very good at doing that, because if you've done any research in Ireland, you'll find out that they did that to the Irish too, only by that time they were sending the Irish to Australia, because the Revolutionary War had already occurred, so they were no longer the colonies of England. But you'll also find out that later on in this time period, free Scots, not prisoners, but just people who wanted to immigrate, came in, and a lot of them settled in the areas of New Jersey and the Carolinas during this time period. You'll find a lot of times the Highland Scots would come and settle in the frontier areas. A lot of land, they could create a farm, grow a large family. Whereas on the opposite end, the Lowland Scots would settle in the urban areas, like the major cities like Philadelphia and Boston and that sort of thing. Totally different from where they were before in the old country. A lot of times you'll notice when you're tracing immigrant origins that the immigrant would settle in areas that reminded them of their home. The Scots were a little bit different in that respect. Even though they would settle with other Scots from the areas they were from, they liked to go in the opposite direction. So instead of the mountains and the hills and the highlands, they were settling in the frontier regions. Instead of the lowlands and plains, the lowland Scots would settle in cities. During this time period too, Philadelphia, which was one of the major cities during this time, was the common port of entry. Now, between the 1700s and the 1800s, you do have a lot of immigration from Scotland, because this is the time period where you have the Battle of Culloden. After that battle, the English crown broke up the clan system. It was illegal to have clans in Scotland. So a lot of those Scottish who were protected by the clans immigrated. And most of those settled in the Carolina areas and in Virginia. So if you have an ancestor from Scotland who may have immigrated during the 1700s or the early 1800s, that's probably where they came through. Now, if we talk about the 1800s and 1900s, we've got a lot of European battles going on at the beginning of this time period. Napoleon, the War of 1812. So there wasn't a whole lot of immigration happening during this time period. But the second half of the time period, that Scotland lost a lot of its population during that time period. It was also the time period where the Industrial Revolution was starting. So a lot of single men and women looking for jobs and looking for opportunities that they weren't finding in Scotland immigrated to the US and started working in factories and such. Any family groups that may have came over during this time period probably settled in regions where they could become farmers and grow crops. But once you find that location and you're back in Scotland and you want to track the records further back and find out about the Scottish ancestry you have, you're going to be looking at different administrative units that they categorize different documents in. And starting from large to small, you're going to be looking at counties, or what they called shires. You'll be looking at burghs, parishes, which was a critical point because you're going to have both church parishes as well as civil parishes. This is where the birth, marriage, and death records are going to start to come into play. Registration districts, estates, and farms. So let's start with the counties first. Counties were usually named after a primary town. So for example, if Edinburgh was the primary town in the county, it would have been called Edinburghshire or Edinburgh County. These are historic subdivisions. They started back in the Middle Ages. They are not used anymore since the 1970s. Around 1975, Scotland redid their whole way they categorize documents. But before that time, you're still going to be utilizing these particular units. They do still use the counties for land registration, which makes it easier for them to pinpoint where the land is. And then the next one down was burghs. These are similar to a town. Again, these were also abolished in 1975, but for our purposes of research, they're still going to be in play. There were several different types of burghs. You would have the royal burgh, which was a charter from the crown. Usually these were located at seaports. There would be a barony, which were charters that were granted to landowners of a secular or ecclesiastical nature. You had the parliamentary burghs, which was at the time period these and the police burghs were set up. They were trying to take away some of the power from the churches and give it to the local governments. So that's when these were put into play. And the example I use here is the valuation rolls. They were categorized first by county and then by burgh. So if you were looking at valuation rolls for your particular person in their particular area, you'd be looking at the county first, and then under the county, you'd be looking at the burgh they belonged in. Then the next unit that we go down to is parishes. Again, we have church or ecclesiastical and civil. These are going to be, many of the records were structured by the parish. One of the reasons that parishes were critical is because of the fact that the inhabitants in each of the parishes would pay part of their produce that they were growing or coins that they had accumulated to the local clergy, because at the time before civil registration was, and the government was taking over more of these things, they were responsible for building the roads and taking care of the poor and all the things that the local government soon adopted. It was also a convenient way for the church and the crown to record information for taxation and school education and road building, etc. Now, the church records during this time period, this earlier time period, you're going to see a lot of things referred to as old parish registers or old parochial registers, or OPRs is usually how it's listed. And when you see that abbreviation, that's what they're talking about, is old church records. And then we have the civil parishes as well, which took over those civil responsibilities later on, such as the poor relief and other things. And then back when we start civil registration in 1855, they set up within the civil parishes, they set up registration districts, which are usually pretty much the same boundaries. So they'd have a registrar that was appointed. He would be the person, he or she would be the person, it usually was a male, who would register the births, the marriages, and the deaths in that particular area. They would keep 2 copies, one locally, and the other one they would send to the Registrar General for Scotland in Edinburgh. Some of these records still exist. Some of these records have been lost. But it's always a good idea to check to see if the record for your particular area is still in existence. And then we have the estates. So if your ancestor was a tenant on an estate, their names are going to be somewhere in those estate paperworks, because they had to lease land if they leased it, or they paid rent, their names would be there. Some of the estate records have been sent to the National Archives of Scotland. Some of the larger estates have their own archives, which it would indicate to you then that you would have to write to that personal archive and request information, which you may or may not get. It just depends on how kind the person who owns that particular estate currently is willing to part with the information. But like I said, they'll have lists of tenants within those papers. They should have rentals or leases within those papers. So they would have to keep track of that, because at some point they would have to pay the crown for whatever they were getting from the tenants that they were leasing their land to. And then the smallest division was a little farm. These were usually owned by 2 parties. And a lot of these farms, they have maps now. The National Records of Scotland has maps showing where the farms were located and the boundaries of the farms. The records, again, you're running a business, so it's a farm. They're going to have expenses, labor, harvest and yield records, planting records, shipping records. If the National Records of Scotland has those records available to you, you're going to find out a lot of information about the joint tenancy of that farm. And if they did indeed hire people to work on that farm, they would have records of that as well. So now that we've kind of covered an overview of the administrative units where the records are going to be found, let's talk a little bit about the Scottish themselves. The pattern that they utilize for naming their kids, and you will find a lot of Johns, a lot of Williams, a lot of James, but normally the given name, we're going to start with the given name, and then we'll talk a little bit about surnames. The first son was usually named after the paternal grandfather, okay? If before the second son was born, that first son passed away, the second son would be named again after the paternal grandfather. But if that first son was still alive and the second son was born, he would be named after the maternal grandfather. And then the third son would be named after the father. First daughter would be named after the maternal grandmother. Then the second daughter would be named after the paternal grandmother. And then the third daughter would be named after the mother. So there could be 2, maybe 3 Marys in the family. Mary was a very common name for the females. Elizabeth was another common name. Anne would be another common name. This is a general, not hard and fast rule, but this is usually what you'll find. So if you're kind of wondering, okay, now, my ancestor's name was William, and he was the third son, wonder what his father's name was. You can kind of use it as a guide to narrow down your search. The same way with Scottish surnames. It wasn't until around the 1100s that they started adopting surnames. Usually, again, the spellings are not fixed. You've probably found that out as you've done any research in the US. Surnames were spelled differently as time went on, and I'll show you an example of that later on. But they could have taken the name from the clan that they lived under. So they could have adopted the surname of Bruce or Graham, but they may not have been blood relations. They just may have been part of the clan. They could have been patronymic names, such as if William had a son, instead of his last name was Campbell, for instance, he might have been William Williamson or William Williams. Sometimes they didn't use the son or the S at the end of the name. They might have used the Mick or Mac. So son of Cormac would have been called Mick or Mac Cormac. Maybe they adopted a surname based on an occupation like Weaver, or a locality like Douglas, which is a term for the lock. So, or a nickname, maybe the ancestor had decided to adopt a nickname that he was been called in the clan. Maybe he was the tallest one in the clan and his nickname was Long, so therefore the surname became Long. But we do have several books out there. There's a lot of things on the internet about how the surnames were adopted. And it's very interesting to find that out. And it kind of gives you an idea of what to look for. So we're going to talk about Scottish records now. And the types of records we're going to be looking at will be civil registration, church, census, the wills and the land records, and we'll kind of go over some of the miscellaneous records that you might find out there. Now, before civil registration in 1855, you've got less of a chance of a lot of records because since we won't have civil registration, you'll be looking at church records as well as census records, which started in 1801 and every 10 years to 1911. They have, just like England does, just like Ireland does, a 100-year privacy law. So census records won't be available to the public until 100 years after. So even though the 1921 has been released, it is currently only being able to be looked at Scotland's people. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Probate land and military records would be other records that you'd be looking for before the civil registration started. We're also going to be looking at cursive handwriting. Back in the 1700s, they used 2 types of cursive writing. It's called italic or secretary. Sometimes it's a combination of both. There is an online tutorial to kind of give you an idea of how to figure out what the words are in these particular handwriting styles at scottishhandwriting.com. It's a really great tutorial, and I'm going to show you an example of it in a minute. You can also find a lot of the parish records that this handwriting will be in Family Search, obviously, as well as Scotland's People. And here's an example of one of what the OPR, or Old Parish Records, looks like. This one here is in Edinburgh in 1693. And here's the transcription down here. Basically, it's going to say Mr. Robert Innes, who would be the father. He's come into the registrar's office to register the birth. His occupation, writer to Her Majesty's Signet. So he's got a really nice job. And Sophia Smith. Sophia will be the mother, and they're going to use her maiden name in the document, okay? ADN is an abbreviation that the registrar used so he wouldn't have to write it out, but it's a daughter named. So if they'd had a son, it would have been ASN, a son named, and Matalena would be the name of the child. Then they would list all the witnesses. So we have a Montgomery, who was a merchant, and the letters in brackets is what they left out because they abbreviate a lot of these terms that they use over and over again. But you'll notice Montgomery is spelled slightly different than what we normally would assume Montgomery would be spelled. We have a Kennard, who was also a merchant. We have a Matlock, who was a merchant. We have a Harold, who was a painter. And we have Robert's brother, Alexander. So now we have another piece of the puzzle. Not only do we know the father's name, the mother's name, and the child's name, but we also know the uncle's name. So if we run into a problem finding Robert in future records, we can try tracking down Alexander and seeing what's going on there. Baptized and born on Wednesday, the 12th of April, and they use 2 L's for April. Instant indicates this is the same year. So the same year that they came in to register is the same year the child was born. Forenoon, born in forenoon, and baptized in the afternoon. So the child was born in the morning, and then they baptized the child in the afternoon. So, and it was all both done on the same day. Doesn't always hold true, even though they were required to register the child. They had a few days grace, so they may not have come in on the same day the child was born. Okay, but fortunately for these particular parish records, they are going to ask the person what date they were born. You'll find some records in some other countries where the date of birth will be further down on the page and the date of registration will be further up on a page. But at least in these, they're pretty straightforward. They tell you the date they were baptized, the date they were born. If it wasn't in the same year, they would list that there. Now, after 1855, when they put civil registration into place in Scotland, it was required to register your child birth, you register a marriage, and you register a death. The civil authorities didn't care if you got married in the church, didn't care if you got baptized, even though they would indicate information if it was provided to them. But as long as you came into the office to get the birth registered or the marriage registered or the death registered, you were good. They would be listed by registration district, which would be similar to the civil parish. Ancestry has some of these. Find My Past has a lot of these. Family Search has a lot of these records, and Scotland's People does. Scotland's People is run by the government of Scotland, and they do require payment. You can sign up for a subscription like you would for Ancestry, or you could pay per document. The only reason I didn't put $ by Ancestry and Find My Past is I'm listing them as the library edition. You can get an individual subscription to Find My Past and Ancestry. But if your library has paid for a subscription to those two, you could go to your local library or here at Midwest Genealogy Center and do the research pretty much for free. But Scotland's People will require payment. So for birth records, when they register the child's birth, you're going to look and see the child's name, the place they were born, the date, the time of birth, parents' names, father's occupation. Again, it's going to include the mother's maiden name in there. And then it'll also include where and when the parents got married. So you get quite a lot of information on those civil records. Now, if you're looking at marriage records, you'll get obviously the couple's name, their ages and occupations, marital status, the location, the date of the marriage, what religion they were. Now, the Church of Scotland was the primary religion, but there was many Catholics in Scotland and other religious groups as well. So they would list what religion they were. You get the parents' names, the father's occupation, and again, the mother's maiden name. And then finally, for death records, you get the deceased's name, their gender, their age, their occupation, their marital status, single, widowed, married. If they were married, they'd also list the spouse's name. And didn't matter if they were 15 or 115, they would also list the parents' names and what his father's occupation was, the mother's maiden name, and the cause of death. So you do get a lot of information in the civil registration records. And as I said, the Church of Scotland was the main denomination, and these are what the old parish registers of the OPRs would look like. Some of the parishes didn't keep records until the 1800s, but some of them, if you're lucky, go all the way back to the 1500s. They were in English, so we're not having to learn a foreign language in order to read them, but there was no standard format. But basic information is still pretty much there. Again, you can look at Ancestry and Family Search for a lot of this information, and Scotland's People as well. Usually when we're talking about records in Family Search and Ancestry, you might get primarily an index because Scotland's People would have the images. Also, too, the Kirk Session records are available on Family Search as well as the National Records of Scotland. That's what the meetings were of the church administration. So the church administration, we get together and discuss their congregation. What was going on? Who did what? You know, did somebody do something wrong? They bring them into the session and tell them what their punishment is going to be for whatever they did. I've seen one where a man and a woman were brought in because they had committed adultery, and the Kirks were telling them exactly what their punishment was going to be for that offense. So we have census records as well. They are kind of similar to the US records. 1801 to 1831, they only have head counts. So remember those tick marks on the 1840 and earlier records that we have in the US? That's basically what you would see. After 1831, they at least started listing the head of the household, and then by 1851, they started listing everybody in the household. By 1855, instead of somebody going from door to door taking the information, they would deliver a form to the head of the household, and he was supposed to fill it out and return it by a certain time period. So the day he would do that, the only people he could put on that particular sheet was the people who were physically there in the house. So if a son or a daughter was visiting a neighbor or going to visit an uncle in another town, he could not be included. He or she could not be included. He could be included on the one that the uncle was filling out if he was there when the uncle was filling out his form, but he wouldn't be listed on the form where he normally would live if he wasn't there physically when the head of the household filled out the form. Again, the latest one available to the public is 1921, and you can find that on Scotland's People. Again, Family Search, Ancestry, and Find My Past have indexes for the census records. Scotland's People has the images. So then we have wills, and there's two types of property that you'll find on a will. You'll find the heritable one, which is pretty much the stationary stuff, the land, the building, the title, if there was one, and then the movable, the furniture, the cows, the crops, whatever could be physically moved. The inheritable property would be the direct descendant or the eldest son, for example. The movable property would be divided into three parts. The widow would get a third. The children would get a third. So if he had 8 children, they divide that third up among the 8 children. And then whoever the person who wrote the will wanted the third piece to be. So if it was the bartender at the local tavern, he could give him a third of his. It didn't matter. It could be his best friend. It could be he gave it to a particular child. It just depended on the whim of the person writing the will. And then you can find a testamentary index or a will index. It's Scotland's People. They have one from 1513 to 1925. Family Search has index as well as Ancestry. You can find the images of some of these wills at Scotland's People, but they don't have the digital images put up after 1925. Obviously, we're talking privacy issues again. But if your Scotsman or Scotswoman was of lower middle class or poor, you probably didn't have a will. And so if you passed away, it would just succeed to the eldest child. Land records. Scotland was a little bit behind the times until the middle 20th century because they still had the feudal system in place. Basically, what that meant is the crown owned everything. And then they would delegate to their vassals portions of land. And if that vassal wanted to rent or lease out portions of that land that they were leased out to from the crown, they could do so. And then you would have a taxation where the tenant would pay the vassal, who would pay the crown, etc. And up until the late 1800s, they had a what they call a service of heirs paperwork that they had to fill out and retours. And what the service of heirs is it was a legal document where the person who was, let's say there was a will and the eldest son was supposed to get the land. Well, the eldest son would have to fill out a document, send it to a court, a chancery court. The court would hold a hearing with a jury. And the heir, the so-called heir, would have to prove that he was the rightful heir to this property. And the jury would determine if he made his case or not. And if he made his case, then they would give him his land. So the service of heirs were the documents for the court case, and the retours was the verdict of the jury. And a lot of those indexes and some of those images you can find in Family Search and Ancestry. But there was also other documents involved, the saisines, which would be the register of the actual transfer of land. So after the heirs, for example, was told by the jury that he is indeed the heir, he would need a saisine to transfer the land from the deceased person to him. Or if they were selling land from one to the other, they would have a saisine. They would also have summaries of these saisines, which would be called abridgments. There would be minute books, which is kind of the Reader Digest version of the registers, and search sheets, which is kind of like a one page where they would list every owner of that particular land throughout history. And it would tell what volume and page number that particular piece of paper would be in. Some of them were very short, some of them could have been very lengthy. But again, there were different forms for different things. And you can find a lot of those indexes, again, at our usual suspects, this Family Search and Ancestry. You can find a lot of the actual images at the National Records of Scotland. Then you have miscellaneous records. You could have military records. You know, we did talk about earlier, you know, the English and the Scots had battles. The Scots kept some of the records for their particular armies. If at some point when Scotland became part of the United Kingdom and the Scottish were fighting in English armies, you could find some of those records, but you would be looking at the National Archives in England for those particular military records. Occupational records. Let's say you were a carpenter and you belonged to a carpenters organization or union. You could find records on that. Tombstones, electoral registers, poor law union records, land taxes, newspapers. There was a lot of information in a lot of the different newspapers. You might find a family history, say on the Campbells or the McDonalds, deeds and city directories as well. So perhaps you're looking for those living cousins back in Scotland. You could check out some city directories and see if you can find some people living in the same area. Here's an example of one of our miscellaneous records called valuation roll, which is basically another tax record. Scotland's people has quite a lot. It starts in 1855, and they do have some up to 1996, but a lot of those later records you can't actually view. But in 1854, they had what they called a Land Valuation Act, which kind of got the land valuation in a more organized manner. So they set up as an assessor, sort of like, Jackson County Assessment Office or whatever assessment office you have when you pay taxes on your home. And every year they do this. They would assess the value of the properties. And they would get the name of the owner. And if there was a tenant or somebody who was occupying the property and it wasn't the owner, they would list that on there. And then they would list what it was worth. These are really good if you're looking for somebody between the 10-year census records. Of course, you're going to look at the head of the household mainly, or the wife, because they wouldn't list the children necessarily on a valuation roll. However, it's also good for using the history of buildings. You can track who owned the building and how long the building had been in existence. Scotland's People has an excellent index for this. And I've got listed on here all the different ways you can search that index. Year, surname, given name. So if you know the place, you can type that in. If you know the year you want to look for, you could type that in and do the search. Before the civil registration, you're going to find fewer records, but you also have alternatives because, as we know, taxes are forever. So we have poll and hearth taxes that were levied at the end of the 17th century. Scotland's Places, which is another website, has information on that. In the 1600s, we had a land tax. National Records of Scotland has that. So there will be other records available if indeed the valuation roll that you're looking for didn't survive. And here's an example of a page. And we're going to look at that top one there. And it basically tells you what the property is. There's a house on this land, where it's located, who the owner is, who the tenant is, and if the occupier is different from the tenant, they would list that there. And then it goes into listing how much it's valued at. Now here's a list of some of the online resources that you'll probably be looking at when you're looking for Scottish records specifically. We have Scotland's Family. We've talked about that. Scotland's People, the National Library, Scottish Documents, again, the National Archives of England. If you're looking at information that might pertain to military records that from Scottish folks who were in the English military during particular wars and battles. Ancestry, Family Search, Find My Past. Find My Past started out as an English database. So before they had stuff from other countries, they were primarily focused on England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. So they do have accumulated over time a lot of different records. So you can find on Find My Past, for example, birth, marriage, and death records, census and military records, the historical newspapers, migration records, the prison registers. At one point, they couldn't ship everybody to America, so they had to put them in prison. Catholic records for all the dioceses in Scotland. And Find My Past also says, this is according to them, that these are the exclusive records. Nobody else has these records but them. The Catholic records from the 8 dioceses, Scotland monumental inscriptions, which I'll show you an example of in a minute. And then you've got some different indexes and information from various locations. So they won't cover all of Scotland, they may cover certain parts of Scotland. So for example, if you find your ancestors are from Glasgow, you might want to look at Glasgow Death and Burial Index from 1642 to 1855. And here's an example of one of those inscriptions that you can find on Find My Past. This one's from 1944, and it has quite a few people listed on it. We've got the Reverend Alexander Waddell. We've got his wife listed there. We've got his eldest son listed there, his younger son listed there. And then way down in the smallest print at the bottom, you've got the youngest son's wife. and they're all listed there on that one monument. They do have a lot of images for these, and I also have some of them that don't have images, but they do have transcriptions. In fact, all of them have transcriptions. It's just some of them may have images as well. Especially if they're pretty hard to read, it's nice to have an image of it as those headstones and monuments get older and older, and it's harder and harder to read them because of the weather damage to them. But they, Find My Past, have quite a lot of that online. And then to add to your online resources, there are books and periodicals. All of these that I've got listed here, we do have here at Midwest Genealogy Center, but I'm sure that those of you online can find them at other libraries as well. The one I want to point out to you first is Scottish Genealogy by Bruce Drury. If you're looking for the Yoda of Scottish genealogy, Bruce Drury is the guy. He has done several books on Scottish genealogy, very good books, goes into in-depth on all the different records and where they can find them in the history of Scotland. He's done many different webinars and presentations on Scotland genealogy. If any of you are subscribed to Legacy Family Tree webinars, he's got a 12-part series on Scottish genealogy. You also have the Family Tree Scottish Genealogy Guide, Tracing Your Scottish Ancestors, and periodicals. Not only periodicals that are from Scotland themselves, but also in the US, where there's a large concentration of Scottish descendants, such as the North Carolina Scottish Heritage Society. So you can find those particular, sometimes they just print them online. Sometimes you will subscribe to them and they'll send them to you, or you can come here or to another genealogy library and see if you can find them at that library. So there are different resources online in a hard copy that you can utilize to trace your Scottish ancestors. And if you have any questions or comments or help wanting to be directed in a particular place to go, here's our information, our address, our phone number, here's our website, and our email address. That email address is for our query service. So if you have a specific question, I'm looking for the 1911 Scottish census for so-and-so who was from such and such, and you can't find it, but you want to see if we can, feel free to let us know. Send us an email and we'll try to find it for you. If we do find it, we will send it to you. That is our presentation.